In the early stages of the pandemic and amid the lockdowns imposed by authorities, there was talk about a reduction in carbon emissions and the improvement of air quality in quite a number of places. However, now, months later, there is growing concern over the surge in pandemic-related non-recyclable waste products, including face masks and, of course, single-use disposable packaging. But the relationship between COVID-19 and the environment appears to go well beyond that of just pollution. So for a better understanding of the complex nature of this relationship, I have Professor Sonu Young from Konkuk University. Welcome to the program, Professor Sonu.
Thank you.
And I also have Andreas Reumann from the Green Climate Fund. Hello, Mr. Reumann.
Hello, thank you.
Mr. Reumann, I'll start with you. Can we begin with a explanation, a simple one perhaps, if possible, about man's abuse of his environment leading to the outbreaks of infectious diseases like COVID-19?
Indeed, a very good question to ask. My colleagues and I, from the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Funds, we look at that question of evidence and causality. And what we found is that, yes, the World Health Organization has yet to deliver a clear link and clear relationship between COVID and climate change. What we know, though, is from past experiences, so from past pandemics such as Ebola, MERS and SARS, we know that over 70% of human diseases are related to animals. And that gives us a very good question to look at global warming. So when we look at global warming, let's look at the planet and think about the planet as a minefield of pathogens. And those pathogens with a capacity to infect hosts. So climate change is the major or the single most important catalyst for this opportunity to arise. Why? It's simply put, climate change disrupts the ecosystems and therefore forces these pathogens as well as these hosts to move around. So if you think of global warming has affected the species and the wildlife and has caused major changes and they had to change and leave. That means in result of that, you have species that are now meeting and should never have met before. And that causes that spread that we call a geographic pandemic spread over the last century. So we may want to ask this question, what now? What can we do? What can we do to prevent such future outbreaks? And from the climate perspective, it is to address the imbalance that we currently have in our nature environment. So we need to address the threats to the ecosystem, the threats to biodiversity, the threats to wildlife, pollution, as well as the greater scheme of climate change. And now the question that I often ask is, where are we at the moment? And here I'd like to say, from the World Meteorological Organization, for the WMO, it says that we're very far away from actually reaching the Paris Agreement targets that we had put to ourselves on climate change. And here we need to say that we are even facing, in the next century, an increase of 3% in temperature, which would cause dramatic changes that I just described.
Mm-hmm. And before we delve into those rather gloomy changes, sure. Professor Sonu, as I mentioned at the start of the talk, there is reports of improvements in air quality amid the pandemic, in its initial stages, of course. Right. Is there any truth to this?
Well, as we all know, not only air pollution, but environmental pollution in general is a function of human activity. So the more human activity we have, the more pollution we're going to get. The less we have, the less pollution we're going to get. But there are two things that we have to remember. When COVID finally ends, we're going to have a resurgence of human activity. That's going to mean an increase again in air pollution and other types of pollution. The second thing is we have to look at the environmental pollution problem in a comprehensive sense. I don't know if you remember, but in Korea there was this environmental policy for solid waste management called, in Korean, 쓰레기 종량제. In English it would be something like volume-based solid waste management system. From my perspective, it was a failure initially. because you had all sorts of illegal burning, in agriculture burning, crop residue and whatnot, and even in the apartment complexes, you had a lot of illegal burning going on. That led to a lot of increased air pollution. So in environmental pollution kind of policies, we have to look at it very comprehensively because it's all interconnected. So once COVID ends, we still have to look at it from the COVID perspective, air pollution perspective, in a very comprehensive sense.
Right. And talking about being interconnected, Professor Sono, there has been research about the relationship between COVID-19 or the severity of COVID-19 and air pollution. Could you tell us a bit about this?
Yeah, I'm not really an expert on this, but there are a lot of studies, obviously, that are going on because it's such a hot topic. To make correlations regarding air pollution and COVID-19 cases, I think is very dangerous right now. Because most health studies, you need some long-term studies. And this has been less than a year. And to make conclusions regarding this is very dangerous. Also, there's a lot of, when you study correlation studies, it means that one reason can have an impact on both results. So a lot of times you have these poor countries that are very bad in treating air pollution. Obviously, you're going to have more COVID cases because their health system is not that great either. So is the reason COVID-19 that is adding to the air pollution or air pollution adding to the COVID? It's very difficult to tell the really one-to-one correlation.
Right, we'll have to wait and see then.
Yeah.
Mr. Reumann, now this is something else I mentioned at the start of the talk. There is much concern about the rise in pandemic-related waste products like face masks and, of course, plastic. Just for the sake of clarity, how severe is this issue right now?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's actually quite severe. So if we think about the single-use face masks as well as other disposals, so we're thinking about plastic waste and others, we can clearly see that this is leading to environmental degradation. So and that's a great concern. So the question of how we could answer to this, well, it is a question of behavioral change. It is really a question of how each and every one of us takes an active step to make this a little bit of a better world. And from a perspective of a Green Climate Fund, we have the mandate to do work in the climate space, but we also want to contribute to this. So for instance, the GCF, the Green Climate Fund colleagues have encouraged each other to use reusable containers for lunches, use water dispensers, bring their own reusable water bottles to reduce any other plastic waste. And then in addition to this, from an institutional perspective, you could also say that institutions can reduce the use of plastic during conferences or board meetings even. So, and then the other question is coming to the climate mandate. The Green Climate Fund is the largest dedicated climate fund in the world. So we currently have about 143 projects worldwide, which accounts to 6.2 billion, beg my pardon, 6.2 billion US dollars. And these projects are pursuing nature-based solutions. And secondly, are also looking at efficient ways of using our resources. So these are key measures to look into this question of how can we address waste, how can we address a certain peak in waste related to COVID-19. Right. What we say though is, and that's also through our system and through our business model, we work with entities such as the United Nations Environment Programme as well as the World Health Organization, and we encourage countries we work in to look at how these entities can help to mitigate these risks and adverse impacts that we are facing due to COVID. And let me say this again, the GCF in its mandate is then looking at this question of how can we provide support to countries, now in COVID, but also after COVID, to look at sustainable ways, sustainable consumption, sustainable production, as well as decent and green jobs, and the efficient use of our natural resources.
Right. Professor Sono, the use of such plastic products, however, appears inevitable given the current pandemic and given the desire for non-contact delivery services, because we can't go out, well, not we can still go out, but there are people across the world that are facing lockdowns as well. Is there a way to balance our need to stay safe with that of the environment amid the pandemic?
Well, that looked like it's the $6 million question, right?
It is, yes.
Like Andreas mentioned, I think it's very important to re-educate the public regarding the environmental mentality. I always feel that, and I don't mean to put ourselves down, but I have a feeling that we're still a little behind in the environmental mentality aspect compared to like European countries and other countries. But this COVID-19 has put us at a spot where we have to think about all these environmental problems and whatnot. I think it's, on the other side, I think it's a good opportunity for us to try to convince people how important this is. This past summer we had a whole bunch of typhoons and other climate problems, so-called meteorological problems that are maybe or may not be related to climate change. But I think the proof is there now. A lot more evidence is coming in. So being a professor, I think it's very important to educate the public, and not only the public in Korea, but on the whole world.
Right. Mr. Reumann, what would you propose as part of efforts to ensure balance then between the need to stay safe and to safeguard the environment in the midst of a raging pandemic?
Well, that's a tricky question to answer, to be honest. But look, as I said, I think what's clearly put out in front of us is now the link that we have. So we have that link between the environment and the health. And I'd like to quote the United Nations Environment Programme. I always use this quote because I find it very, very timely. And they say, COVID-19, for the worst things that happened with it, it is also a reminder that human health is very much interlinked with the Earth's health. So we ought to look at this, and we ought to think about ways forward to really create sustainable life here on Earth. And that's a grander stand, to be honest. But let me come back to this question of education and educating people. And I very much endorse this position that we really need to look at how can we change the behavior. And I'm not only talking about the policy side of things. So often, changing behavior is often referred to as we need better public policy that would look at that. But it's actually also for each and every one of us for the day-to-day operations. And I think that hinted, Professor, you almost hinted at that point to say some countries may have approaches that we can learn from. And here I want to say, COVID, for all that it was and that it is currently, it's also an opportunity to learn. And the environment shows us that the environment has a critical role in this, because it not only describes where COVID has emerged from and where the origin lies with COVID, but it also helps us to think about what are ways forward to resolve these issues in a post-pandemic world. And the GCF here puts clear measures in and says, okay, let's look at this question of economic stimulus. And GCF, as the Green Climate Fund, and the largest Green Climate Fund, just to say that again, is clearly advocating for greening of the economic stimulus. And so how would we look at that? We would look at it as low emission and climate resilient stimulus packages that would help the leaders of this world to address both of the questions at the same time. So the economic recovery, as well as the challenges that we're currently facing with climate change. The question then is, these leaders have to look at this question of how to finance this. And coming from the Green Climate Fund, we talk a lot about finance, and we very much advocate for looking at innovation in finance. So innovative financial structures that would help to put these economic stimulus into action, but at the same time, do not create additional burdens to vulnerable countries or developing countries as they are already facing a debt crisis in many countries, in many regions over the world. So here we say that there should be a stronger link, and the GCF plays a vital role in looking at how private sector could be linking to climate interventions and climate investments by saying, okay, we look at different variety of instruments that we could employ to help the private sector to catalyze that.
Now, prior to what Mr. Reumann had said, I would have thought that the best way to deal with climate change would be to ease our carbon footprints. But based on what Mr. Reumann has just said, Professor Sonu, I would think then you would need to perhaps consider the health sector in efforts to better deal with climate change. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, definitely health and safety is very important. But being an air pollution engineer myself, the root cause of this problem, climate change and all these other impacts, is greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm all for directing our energy, our funds and other things on adaptation, on looking at impacts. It's very important. But it must not take us away from going away from the root cause, to preventing the greenhouse gas emissions, which is the sole cause of all these problems. Korea especially, I think, is in a position where it's not very looked highly upon regarding climate change issues. Just recently, we were quoted by an NGO, climate NGO, as being one of 4 evil countries regarding climate change, which is not a stigma that you want to have attached to your country. Also, we're still struggling with coal-based power plants, not only for our country, but for exporting the technology for building coal-fired power plants in other countries. So these kind of problems our country is dealing with, we're still very much development-based, advancement-based, rather than being environmentally conscious. This new Green New Deal that the current government has really been propping up, actually, it's receiving a lot of bad feedback from international organizations. It's not very specific. It doesn't have the right spirit, if you may. So I think we have to have more than just words. We need to actually have actions that tell the world that we are serious about this climate change problem and all these impacts.
I understand this next question is going to be quite tough then. What should, in your opinion, Korea do then to better tackle that is the dual challenge of pollution and the pandemic?
Okay, did you say European countries? Or?
Korea.
Oh, Korea, yeah. Well,
I don't want the stigma of being an evil country. Neither do you. So.
That's true. Again, the government, I think, has to be more, put more spirit into this. I think we just have not been very conscious of the environmental problem. The government itself, I think, needs to be more specific regarding the climate change issues. We always talk about it in broad terms, but we don't have the specifics, and that's why we're being banged up by other countries. But also, since I talked about the government in the last question, the public also needs to be much more aware. I have this favorite quote that I always say is that, how Korean parents are very keen on educating their children. Well, if they could just think about where their children are going to live in, what kind of world their children are going to live in, a little while they're thinking about all these academic institutions and all the jobs and who they're going to marry and stuff, if they put just a little effort into thinking about the world that they're going to live in, I think we could have a much cleaner country. And so it's going to be a very comprehensive effort by the government, by the private sector, by the public sector. Right now it's very difficult because of the corona issues. But I think we have to prepare in advance before the corona issue gets settled, of how we're going to tackle this problem from a government perspective and from a public perspective.
I see. All right, Professor Sonu, thank you very much for your thoughts. And Mr. Reumann, again, thank you for being with us today. Owing to the lack of time, we'll have to end it there. Right, well, that brings us to the end of today's edition of COVID-19. Tomorrow, we bring you details about COVID-19 and its impact on children and our furry friends. In the meantime, do take care and see you tomorrow.